Hello, and welcome. This channel tells history through the eyes of those who lived it. If you value stories that go beyond dates and facts, please subscribe to support the channel. Like the video if it resonates with you, share it to keep these memories alive, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Thank you for being here. Why was the Great Wall built on human bones? What did it cost to build the Great Wall of China? I was forced to build the Great Wall and never went home. The Great Wall was not built to protect us. I did not know the name of the wall when they came for me. I did not know how long it would stretch, how many mountains it would climb, or how many lives it would swallow. I only knew that one morning, before the sun fully rose, soldiers stood at the edge of my village and read out names as if they were counting grain. Mine was one of them. I remember my mother standing behind me, silent, her hands clenched into the fabric of her robe. I remember my father lowering his head, not in submission, but in calculation, as if trying to measure how much of our family would be lost with my departure. No one asked where we were going. Everyone already knew. The wall had been growing for years, spoken of in whispers, described as duty by those who never touched its stones. They told us it was for protection. They told us it was for the empire. They told us it would bring peace. I believed them, because belief was lighter than fear. The march began before I understood that there would be no return. We walked in lines that grew thinner each day. Some fell behind from hunger. Some collapsed from exhaustion. The soldiers did not slow their pace. Those who could not stand were dragged aside and left without ceremony. I learned early that stopping to look back only made the road longer. The land changed as we moved north. Fields gave way to rocky paths. Villages became rare. The air grew drier, colder. At night, we slept on bare ground, listening to men whisper about escape, about death, about whether the wall truly needed so many hands. By morning, some voices were gone. When we finally saw it, the wall was not what I expected. It was not a single structure, but many scars carved into the land. Segments rose and fell with the mountains, unfinished, uneven, raw. Smoke hung in the air from fires used to shape stone and harden earth. The sound of labor never stopped. It was like standing beside a living thing that breathed through human effort. They assigned us work without explanation. Carry stones. Mix earth. Haul timber.
Day foundations.
There were no introductions, no names exchanged. Names slowed things down. Here, we were bodies, measured by how much weight we could move before collapsing. I learned the rhythm quickly. Wake before dawn. Work until the sun burned overhead. Eat a handful of grain if there was any. Work again until the light faded. Sleep where you fell. Repeat. Days blended together. Time lost its edges. Only exhaustion marked progress. The wall demanded more than strength. It demanded silence. Complaints were punished. Slowness was punished. Curiosity was punished. I saw a man beaten for asking how long the work would last. I saw another dragged away for refusing to lift a stone after his hand split open. No one intervened. Intervention required energy we did not have. The dead were not taken away. At first, this shocked me. In my village, death was ritual. Here, it was logistics. Bodies were moved just enough to clear the worksite. Sometimes they were buried shallowly. Sometimes they were not buried at all. As the foundations deepened, the dead were placed into the earth and built over. Stone does not distinguish between soil and bone. I told myself this was temporary, that once a section was complete, we would be sent home, that the empire would remember us, that our suffering had a purpose beyond survival. These thoughts sustained me when my body began to fail. My hands hardened, then cracked. My back bent under loads that felt heavier each week. Hunger sharpened everything. Sounds became louder. Light became harsher. Faces grew indistinct. I stopped counting days. I stopped counting losses. Counting required hope. At night, I dreamed of my village. Not as it was, but as it felt. Warm earth.
Familiar voices.
The certainty of belonging somewhere beyond labor. Waking was always worse than sleeping. There were moments when I stood atop the rising wall and looked out over the land. The view was vast, almost beautiful. Mountains stretched endlessly. The wall followed them like a shadow, refusing to end. In those moments, I understood something that frightened me more than the work. This was not meant to be finished by us. This was meant to outlive us. We were not builders. We were materials. The soldiers watched from above, insulated from the work. They spoke of enemies beyond the horizon, of threats that justified the scale of suffering. I never saw these enemies. I only saw men like myself, bent under stone, driven by fear and orders. Once, a boy collapsed near me. He could not have been older than 16. His breath came shallow and uneven. I looked to the others, waiting for someone to help. No one moved. Helping him would slow the line. Slowing the line meant punishment. I learned then that the wall did not only consume bodies. It consumed mercy. When the boy stopped breathing, work continued. I began to understand that the wall was not built only of stone and earth. It was built of decisions made far away, of voices we never heard, of priorities that valued permanence over people. Each layer of stone carried the weight of a life that would not be recorded. I do not know how long I worked before the realization settled fully. Perhaps months. Perhaps years. Time had become unreliable. What I knew was this. I would not leave when the wall was done, because the wall would never be done. It would stretch on, repaired, expanded, reinforced by new hands long after mine failed. That knowledge changed me. I stopped imagining return. I stopped planning escape. Survival became narrower, quieter. Wake, work, breathe, sleep. Anything beyond that was luxury. I watched newcomers arrive with the same belief I once had. I watched it drain from them piece by piece. Sometimes, I wondered if the wall truly protected the empire, or if it existed to remind us of our place within it. A line drawn not just across land, but across lives. I am still here as I write this. My body thinner, my movement slower, the wall higher than it was when I arrived. I have learned where to place my feet, how to lift without tearing muscle, how to conserve breath. These skills mean survival, not freedom. If this record survives me, let it be known that the wall did not rise effortlessly. It rose because countless hands were forced to lift it, because countless lives were deemed acceptable to lose, because stone remembers nothing, and history often chooses not to listen. This is only the beginning. The wall changed the way I understood days. Morning no longer began with light but with sound. The scrape of stone, the thud of earth, the coughs that cut through cold air before the sun appeared. I learned to rise before thought, before memory could weigh me down. Standing up was easier than remembering why I stood. Work expanded as the wall grew. What once felt enormous became routine, and then insufficient. The overseers demanded height, thickness, certainty. Certainty was their word. Stone upon stone. Earth compacted until breath could not pass through it. The wall was meant to be solid, unyielding, eternal. We were meant to be replaceable. My body adjusted in ways I did not recognize at first. Pain dulled into background noise. Hunger sharpened into focus. Sleep became shallow and fragmented. I could wake instantly at the sound of a shouted order. I could lift with precision even when my hands trembled. Adaptation was praised as strength. In truth, it was necessity wearing a different name. New laborious arrived in waves. Farmers, craftsmen, men taken from roads and markets. Their faces carried shock at first, then calculation, then resignation. I saw myself in them, reflected at different stages of loss. I did not offer comfort. Comfort suggested a future that could be trusted. The dead increased as winter approached. Cold exposed weakness quickly. Those with thin clothing lasted weeks at most. Fires were reserved for cooking and stonework, not warmth. We slept pressed against each other for heat, bodies forming temporary shelter against the wind. In the mornings, someone was often missing from the group. No announcement followed. Absence was explanation enough. Burial became efficient. Shallow trenches when time allowed. Foundations when it did not. The wall accepted everything without protest. Bone did not weaken it. Flesh did not stain it. The earth absorbed us all equally. I began to notice how the overseers spoke about us. Not individually, but collectively. Labor capacity. Output. Losses. Numbers replace names. The language made decisions easier. It also made cruelty quieter. When suffering is counted, it becomes manageable. One day, my hands failed me. The skin split deeply along my palms. Blood soaked into the stone I carried. I tried to hide it. Blood invited inspection. and inspection invited judgment. When the overseer noticed, he did not ask if I could continue. He told me to wrap my hands and lift faster to make up for lost time. I did. Pain became rhythm. Rhythm became survival. At night, I wrote in my mind because I had no paper. I formed sentences silently, afraid they would disappear if not shaped. I described faces, movements, the sound the wall made as it settled into place. I did not know if these words would ever leave me. Writing, even imagined, gave shape to days that otherwise collapsed into one another. There were rumors of rebellion in distant sections, men refusing to work, tools hidden, fires set. The rumors traveled faster than proof. Punishments followed whether rebellion existed or not. Fear did not require confirmation. Several men were taken away one evening. We never saw them again. The wall did not pause. I learned the landscape intimately, the curve of each ridge, the way the wind shifted before storms, where the ground softened after rain. Knowledge was power here, but a limited one. It could keep you alive another day. It could not free you. As seasons turned, the wall grew taller than memory. Standing atop it no longer inspired awe. Height lost meaning when descent led only back to labor. From above, I could see the lines of workers stretching along the mountainside like ants carrying fragments of a structure too large to comprehend. The scale made individual effort feel both essential and irrelevant. Illness spread easily. Coughs lingered. Fevers came without warning. Those who fell ill were given fewer rations. Weakness was treated as waste. I watched men work themselves into collapse because stopping meant disappearance. Survival required appearing useful, even when usefulness consumed what remained of you. There were moments of unexpected humanity. A shared mouthful of grain. A hand steadying another under a heavy load. A whispered name remembered from a previous life. These moments were brief and dangerous. Attachment made loss sharper. Still, they happened. The wall did not eliminate kindness. It only punished it. I began to understand that the wall was not simply a defense against enemies beyond the horizon. It was a demonstration. It showed what the state could command, how far obedience could be stretched, how deeply fear could be embedded into stone. The wall was visible proof of authority made physical. As this understanding grew, something inside me hardened alongside my body. I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped imagining recognition. Hope narrowed into endurance. Endurance became identity. I was no longer the person who had left a village. I was a component of a structure that extended beyond any single life. One evening, a storm struck without warning. Rain turned the ground to mud. Stones slipped. A section collapsed partially, injuring several men. The response was immediate and brutal. The collapse was framed as failure, not accident. Those closest were punished. Repairs began before injuries were treated. Stability mattered more than survival. I carried stones past men who could not stand. I did not look at their faces. Looking would have slowed me. Slowness was dangerous. The wall taught efficiency through threat. It refined cruelty into process. When the storm passed, the wall stood again, slightly altered, reinforced with urgency. Losses were recorded somewhere, perhaps. I did not see the records. I only saw the spaces where people had been. Time continued its quiet erosion. Hair grayed. Movements stiffened. Voices grew fewer. I realized I had outlasted many who arrived with me. Longevity here did not feel like victory. It felt like accumulation. Each day survived carried the weight of those who had not. I no longer counted how long I had been here. Counting suggested an end. Instead, I measured the wall. How far it had crept along the ridge. How much higher it rose after each season. The wall was the calendar now. At night, lying against cold earth, I sometimes pressed my ear to the ground. I imagined I could hear what was beneath. Not voices, but presence. A density that reminded me this structure was layered with lives. The thought did not horrify me anymore. It steadied me. If the wall was built from us, then we remained part of it. Morning always came. Work always resumed. The wall continued its quiet consumption. And I continued, not because I believed in the purpose, but because stopping meant becoming part of the foundation without choice. This was no longer the beginning. It was not yet the end. It was the long middle, where endurance replaces hope and survival becomes its own form of silence. The middle years blurred into a single, grinding movement, like a stone turning under constant pressure. By then, the wall had taught us its expectations: speed without haste, strength without complaint, silence without rest. Those who resisted learned quickly that resistance only shortened the distance between effort and disappearance. I was assigned to a section where the ground rose sharply and the wind never settled. Carrying loads uphill changed the body in ways I could not undo. My spine curved. My breathing shortened. I learned to step in rhythm with the slope, placing my feet where others had worn shallow paths into the earth. The wall shaped the land, and the land shaped us back. New overseers arrived with different methods but the same results. Some shouted. Some watched quietly. The quiet ones were worse. Their calm suggested certainty. Certainty made punishment feel administrative rather than cruel. Orders were issued, results were measured, and corrections followed without emotion. The wall advanced. I noticed how language continued to shift. We were no longer called laborious. We were called units. Units could be reassigned, depleted, replaced. The word traveled easily between mouths that never lifted stone. It reduced suffering to adjustment. Illness took on patterns. Weakness in the lungs during cold months. Swelling in the joints during rain. Fevers that arrived suddenly and left slowly, if they left at all. Those who lingered too long near the edge of usefulness were moved to lighter tasks until they recovered or failed completely. Lighter tasks still consumed strength. Recovery was rare. I formed a habit of observing without reacting. This was not indifference. It was economy. Emotion cost energy, and energy was survival. I learned which sounds to ignore and which to register. A shouted name meant punishment. A whistle meant movement. Silence meant exhaustion rather than peace. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, I watched a group finish laying stones along a newly raised segment. The alignment was precise. The surface smooth. From a distance, it looked complete. I knew better. Completion here was illusion. Every finished section invited expansion. Every pause invited demand. The wall was never satisfied. There were moments when the scale of it pressed down on me harder than any load. Standing on a high point, I could see the wall snake across the mountains, vanishing and reappearing like a wound that refused to close. I understood then that no single generation was meant to claim it. The wall belonged to continuity, not accomplishment. Punishment became more refined. Public enough to deter, brief enough not to slow production. A man caught resting too long was forced to carry double loads for days. Another who spoke out was reassigned to the most exposed section during winter. Lessons were delivered efficiently. Memory did the rest. Despite this, bonds formed in quiet ways. Shared glances during moments of rest. Wordless coordination when lifting heavy stones. An understanding of when to step in without being seen. These connections were fragile, but they mattered. They reminded me that we were still human beneath the layers of dust and routine. Food grew scarcer as distance from supply routes increased. Rations shrank. Grain thinned. Hunger sharpened tempers and dulled thought. I learned to eat slowly, letting each mouthful last. I learned to ignore the ache until it faded into background sensation. Hunger became another tool the wall used to shape us. I noticed that my memories of before were changing. Faces blurred. Voices softened. Details slipped away. In their place, the wall inserted its own landmarks. The bend where the wind cut hardest. The section where stones always slipped. The place where the ground swallowed sound. My internal map shifted. Home receded. Death became quieter. Not less frequent, but less dramatic. Bodies failed gradually rather than suddenly. A man would slow, then lag, then stop standing altogether. Removal followed. Work resumed. The rhythm absorbed loss without interruption. One day, I was ordered to help reinforce a foundation that had begun to settle. Digging revealed layers beneath the stone. Compacted earth mixed with fragments that should not have been there. I worked without comment. Recognition was unnecessary. The wall had always been layered this way. Knowing did not change the task. As years accumulated, my role shifted subtly. I was no longer among the youngest or the strongest. I was among the experienced. Experience meant knowing where effort could be conserved, where mistakes would be punished, where the wall demanded precision. I was watched differently. Not valued, but relied upon. That reliance carried its own weight. Failure from me would be noticed. Mistakes would be interpreted as defiance rather than fatigue. I became careful. Carefulness slowed aging, but it also narrowed life. Each movement was calculated. Each breath measured. Winter returned with familiar cruelty. Wind scoured exposed skin. Frost split stones and fingers alike. Fires burned low. We slept closer together, bodies forming temporary barriers against cold. Mornings claimed more people. We stepped around them as required. At times, I wondered whether the wall remembered us. Not in thought, but in pressure. In the way it settled differently where foundations were denser. In the way certain sections held warmth longer at night. The idea did not comfort me. It steadied me. Presence mattered, even if unacknowledged. I stopped marking time altogether. Seasons announced themselves through pain rather than calendars. Cold in the joints. Heat in the lungs. Rain in the bones. The wall responded to each with adjustments, repairs, reinforcements. It learned, just as we did. There were rare days when the work paused briefly due to storms too severe to ignore. On those days, we stood beneath makeshift shelter and listened to wind tear across the stones. The wall endured. We endured. When the storm passed, movement resumed as if nothing had interrupted it. I understood then that endurance was the true currency here. Not loyalty. Not belief. Endurance. Those who endured became part of the structure in a way others did not. We shaped it, and it shaped us in return. As this phase of my life stretched onward, I no longer expected change. Expectation required imagination, and imagination was a luxury. I focused on the immediate, the next lift, the next step, the next breath. The wall rose, and with it, the weight of continuation. I remained because remaining was the only skill I had mastered. The wall did not ask for more than that. It accepted persistence as payment. And so I continued, carrying stone across ground that had forgotten my name, building something that would never remember me, bound to a task that had become indistinguishable from life itself. By the time I understood that age had begun to claim me, the wall had already learned how to proceed without hesitation. It did not slow for stiffness in the joints or for breath that shortened without warning. It accepted effort, not explanation. I learned to accept this exchange as well. My tasks shifted again, not out of mercy but efficiency. I was placed where experience mattered more than speed. Measuring lines. Setting stones so they locked properly. Directing those newer than I was with gestures rather than words. Speech wasted breath. Breath was currency. From this vantage, I saw the wall differently. Not as a single burden carried by many, but as a system that consumed and reassigned endlessly. Fresh bodies arrived with strength and fear. Older bodies faded into roles that delayed disappearance. The cycle continued without pause. The wall fed on continuity. I became familiar with the sound of settling stone. A subtle shift. A low groan carried through the structure. These sounds demanded immediate correction. Failure to respond meant collapse, and collapse meant punishment. We learned to hear danger before it showed itself. Listening kept us alive longer. Winter returned with greater severity than I remembered. Wind cut through layers of cloth that had long since thinned. Frost stiffened fingers until lifting became mechanical rather than deliberate. Stones burned the skin with cold. At night, pain lingered even in sleep. The wall demanded consistency regardless of season. During one particularly harsh period, supplies faltered. Grain arrived late and in smaller measure. Hunger pressed harder than before. Men grew irritable. Movements lost precision. Mistakes increased. Overseers responded with pressure rather than aid. Pressure produced results, though at a cost that did not concern them. I watched men work beyond reason, beyond safety, beyond the point where bodies could recover. Collapse became common. Recovery did not. Those who fell were replaced quickly. The wall advanced as if fed by sacrifice. There were moments when anger rose unexpectedly, sharp and brief. Anger required energy. I learned to let it pass. Sustained anger shortened survival. Acceptance did not mean approval. It meant continuation. My sense of identity narrowed further. I was no longer someone with a past moving toward a future. I was a function within a process. Wake. Assess. Lift. Align. Endure. The simplicity was deceptive. Within it lay constant calculation. Where to step. When to rest without being seen. How to appear useful even when depleted. I noticed how the wall altered the landscape beyond stone. Paths formed where feet repeated the same motions. Hillsides lost vegetation under constant traffic. Water diverted to serve construction needs. The environment bent gradually to the demands of the structure. Nothing remained untouched. At times, distant horns sounded from watchtowers along completed sections. Signals passed between points I could not see. The wall communicated with itself. We were the medium through which that communication moved. Illness returned in waves. Not sudden outbreaks, but persistent weakening. Coughs lingered for months. Fevers returned repeatedly. I learned to recognize the signs of decline early. Those signs rarely saved anyone. They simply marked time. One evening, an older man I had worked beside for years failed to rise. He had been careful, experienced, quiet. His absence altered the rhythm of our work more than I expected. I adjusted positions. I compensated. The wall did not notice. Loss mattered only at human scale. I began to understand the difference between endurance and survival. Survival was immediate. Endurance was cumulative. Each day added weight. Endurance required letting parts of yourself erode without resistance. Memory softened. Desire thinned. What remained was function. From the wall's highest points, the land looked unchanged by our presence. Mountains remained. Valleys stretched outward. The wall appeared as a line drawn deliberately, confidently. From below, the cost was visible everywhere. Broken ground. Discarded tools.
Shallow graves.
Perspective determined meaning. As years pressed on, my movements slowed further. I compensated with precision. Younger men watched and copied. I did not instruct them directly. Observation was safer. They learned quickly. The wall selected for adaptability. Punishments became less frequent for me, not because rules softened, but because I had learned their boundaries. I did not cross them. Knowledge functioned as armor. There were rare moments when work paused long enough for thought to surface. In those moments, I considered the idea of completion. Completion did not mean freedom. Completed sections required guarding, repairing, extending. The wall was a living obligation, not a finished object. The thought did not despair me. Despair implied expectation. I had none left. What remained was presence. Each day existed because it existed. The wall stood because it stood. The exchange continued. One night, lying against stone still warm from the day's labor, I pressed my palm flat against it. The surface felt smooth in places, rough in others. It held heat unevenly. I imagined layers beneath, pressed together by weight and time. The sensation grounded me. Contact was proof of existence. Morning returned. Orders followed. Movement resumed. The wall absorbed another day. I understood then that the wall's greatest strength was not its height or length, but its ability to normalize the unimaginable. What would have seemed unbearable became routine. What would have demanded explanation became background. This transformation occurred quietly, without declaration. I continued to work not because I believed in protection or empire, but because the alternative was erasure without witness. As long as I moved, I remained visible. Visibility delayed disappearance. The wall rose. I remained. And in that remaining, I learned that endurance could hollow a person without breaking them, leaving behind a shape that functioned long after meaning had thinned. There came a point when the wall no longer felt external to me. It did not stand apart as something I worked on. It became the environment in which my body existed, the frame through which all movement passed. I woke within its shadow and slept against its base. My sense of direction aligned with its line. Even my thoughts followed its length rather than wandering freely. Age did not arrive suddenly. It settled in increments. A delay before standing. A hesitation before lifting. A longer pause after breath left my lungs. I adjusted without comment. Adjustment had become instinct. Those who could not adjust disappeared quickly. The wall did not wait for explanation. I was placed increasingly among those who instructed without authority. We showed rather than told. A hand placed here. A stone turned slightly there. Correction delivered through movement rather than words. This reduced conflict. It also reduced individuality. Knowledge flowed silently, efficiently, like water finding the lowest path. Younger workers arrived with bodies still unmarked by long labor. Their movements were faster, less careful. They learned quickly or they did not last. I saw the pattern repeat. Shock, resistance, adaptation, erosion. The wall trained us without mercy. There were days when the work felt almost ceremonial. Stone lifted, stone placed, earth packed tight. The repetition created a rhythm that numbed thought. In that numbness, time slipped. Hours passed unnoticed. Pain retreated into background sensation. The wall advanced without resistance. On other days, everything resisted. Wind, cold, heat, hunger. Bodies refused coordination. Tools slipped. Stones fractured. Overseers tightened control. Pressure increased. These days left marks that did not fade easily. I began to notice how memory behaved under long endurance. It did not vanish completely. It condensed. Instead of many memories, a few remained vivid. My mother's hands at the edge of my robe. The sound of my village at dusk. The first sight of the wall rising from the mountains. These images resurfaced without warning, sharp and brief, then receded. I did not chase them. Chasing required energy. Death became more intimate as my circle narrowed. I recognized faces before they vanished. I remembered names longer than most. Remembering names felt like an act of defiance, though no one else noticed. The wall did not record names. I carried them briefly, until carrying became too heavy. I learned the signs that preceded collapse. A stiffness that did not ease with movement. A cough that deepened rather than cleared. A loss of coordination when lifting. I sometimes adjusted assignments quietly to delay the inevitable. Delay was all I could offer. It felt like something. One winter, colder than those before, took many quickly. Frost split stones and skin alike. Fires burned low. Rations shrank again. Men worked wrapped in layers that restricted movement. Falls increased. Injuries lingered. The wall rose regardless. During that season, I realized that the wall no longer needed overseers to enforce discipline. We enforced it ourselves. Fear had been internalized. Efficiency was self-sustaining. The structure had learned how to perpetuate itself through us. There were rare moments of interruption. A messenger arrived with orders altering priorities. A section was abandoned temporarily. Another was reinforced urgently. These shifts reminded me that the wall was not static. It responded to forces beyond our sight. Politics, strategy, decisions made in rooms we would never enter. Our labor translated those decisions into stone. I thought often about distance. The distance between those decisions and the ground beneath my feet. The distance between intention and consequence. The wall collapsed that distance physically, making abstraction solid. Each stone was an answer to an order we never heard. As my body slowed further, I feared reassignment to tasks that would hasten disappearance. Carrying heavy loads remained dangerous. Digging foundations strained joints beyond recovery. I compensated with precision and reliability. Reliability extended usefulness. Usefulness extended presence. There were days when I stood aside briefly, watching others work. From that position, the pattern was unmistakable. Movement flowed along the wall like blood through a body. Interruptions were corrected. Weaknesses were reinforced. The system adapted continuously. I began to understand that the wall was not only built from human effort, it was built from human compliance. Not the loud kind demanded by force, but the quiet kind learned through survival. Each adjustment made sense in isolation. Together, they formed something enormous. This understanding did not arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. Anger required belief in alternatives. Clarity acknowledged constraints. I saw the wall as it was, without myth or justification. A structure that consumed life to project permanence. I noticed changes in myself that extended beyond the body. My voice lowered. My speech shortened. My reactions slowed. Emotion flattened. This was not numbness. It was efficiency applied inward. Excess feeling had been trimmed away over years of necessity. At times, I worried that when I eventually left this place, I would not know how to exist elsewhere. The wall had defined space, time, and value. Outside it, Those measures might not apply. The thought passed quickly. Leaving was not an expectation I allowed myself. There were moments when newcomers asked quietly how long the work lasted. I did not answer directly. Answers carried weight. Weight crushed hope. I showed them how to lift, how to step, how to rest without being seen. This was the only guidance that mattered. As the wall expanded into harsher terrain, losses increased. Distance from supply lines strained everything. Tools broke more often. Repairs took longer. Bodies weakened faster. The wall adjusted by demanding more. One evening, after a particularly long day, I watched the sun sink behind the structure. The wall cast a shadow that stretched across the ground, covering tools, bodies, and earth alike. In that shadow, distinctions blurred. Stone and skin shared the same color. The image stayed with me. I realized then that the wall's true legacy would not be protection or border. It would be normalization. Future generations would see it as inevitable, monumental, given. They would not feel the labor embedded within it. They would not hear the silence that built it. This realization did not sadden me as much as I expected. Sadness implied expectation of recognition. I had let go of that long ago. What remained was the act of witnessing. As long as I observed, as long as I remembered, something persisted beyond stone. My days continued in measured repetition. Wake, assess, align, endure. The wall grew. I aged. The balance held. I no longer marked seasons by weather alone, but by who remained beside me. Faces thinned. New ones replaced them. I became one of the few constants in a shifting line. Constancy was not celebrated. It was simply used. There were moments when my body signaled that limits approached. Pain lingered longer. Recovery slowed. I adjusted again. Adjustment had become identity. Each change extended my presence by days, then weeks, then months. I understood now that survival here was not triumph. It was participation in something larger and indifferent. The wall did not reward survival. It consumed it gradually. Still, I remained. Because remaining was what I knew how to do. Because movement delayed erasure. Because as long as I worked, I existed in a form that could be observed. The wall accepted this exchange without acknowledgement. It rose stone by stone, life by life, indifferent to the distinction between them. I am old now. Older than the stones I once carried on my back. Older than the watchtowers where I used to stand through frozen nights, staring into darkness that never answered my gaze. When I close my eyes, I no longer see the wall as a line across mountains. I see it as a wound. And as a scar. I remember the day I left it for the last time.
No ceremony, no farewell.
Just a silent descent down a mountain path, my hands empty for the first time in decades. The wall did not stop when my service ended. It continued to grow without me. New hands replaced mine. New bones were buried beneath fresh stones. New cries were swallowed by the same wind that once carried my voice. I had believed, like all of us did at first, that the wall was built to keep enemies out. That it was a shield. A promise of safety. But after a lifetime spent within its shadow, I understood the truth too late. The wall was never meant only to stop those beyond it. It was meant to hold us in place. Every stone fixed our lives to the will of emperors we would never meet. Every watchtower marked how far our footsteps were allowed to go. Every mile of wall taught us obedience through exhaustion. I watched seasons die on the wall. Spring came shyly, barely touching the stones before retreating. Summer burned us until sweat salted our lips and eyes. Autumn stripped the mountains bare, leaving us exposed like insects pinned to rock. Winter arrived like an executioner, slow and patient. Men disappeared quietly. Some collapsed while lifting stones. Some slipped into ravines. Some simply lay down one night and did not rise again. Their names were never recorded. Their stories ended where they fell. We said the wall would remember them. But stone does not remember. It only remains. Years passed. Dynasties changed. Orders shifted. Yet the wall endured, indifferent to banners and bloodlines. Sometimes, riders appeared beyond the horizon. Sometimes they vanished again without attacking. Sometimes the wall worked. Sometimes it did not. But whether enemies crossed it or not, the cost was always paid by those who built it. I once believed that when the wall was finished, suffering would end. That peace would finally arrive. I was wrong. The wall never truly finished. It only paused. Like history itself, it waited for the next command, the next fear, the next ruler desperate to prove permanence in a world that refuses to stand still. When I returned to my village, people looked at me as if I had come back from another world. They touched my hands, rough as broken bark. They asked what the wall was like. I struggled to answer. How do you explain a place that consumes lives one stone at a time? How do you describe something that is both protection and prison? So I told them it was long, that it was high, that it disappeared into the distance like a thought that never ends. That was easier than the truth. Years later, travelers began to come. Not soldiers, not laborious, but curious strangers. They climbed the wall where we once marched. They laughed where we once froze in silence. They took pictures where we once buried our dead. They called it a wonder. I watched them from afar, leaning on a stick, listening to their awe. I did not correct them, because the wall had become something else. It no longer guarded borders. It guarded memory. The wall became a story people wanted to believe. A story about strength, about unity, about civilization standing against chaos. Few wanted to hear about the hands that bled, the backs that broke, the voices that faded into dust. Yet without us, the wall would not exist. Every empire leaves behind monuments, but monuments are not built by emperors alone. They are built by countless unnamed lives, stacked beneath stone and silence. Now, as my breath grows shallow, I think about what the wall truly taught me. It taught me that fear can move mountains, that power can stretch across continents, that humans can build something vast enough to be seen from far away, yet still fail to see each other. The wall stands today not because it was perfect, but because it was human, flawed, costly, relentless. It stands as proof that history is not only written by victors, it is carried by laborious, by soldiers, by those whose names were never carved into stone. I was one of them. I do not ask to be remembered. I only ask that when people walk along the wall, they listen, not to the wind, not to the legends, but to the silence beneath their feet, because that silence once had a heartbeat, and it was mine.